The Untold Alliance, how three nations almost rewrote history. Japan and Germany were allies in World War II. Everyone knows that. But here's what they don't tell you in history class. These two nations, separated by the entire Soviet Union, never actually coordinated their attacks. They never fought together. And this single failure cost them everything. Because if Japan had attacked the Soviet Union from the east, while Germany attacked from the west, Stalin's forces would have been crushed in months. The war would have ended differently. The world you live in today wouldn't exist. So why didn't it happen? The answer is way more complicated than you think. Intro, 35 seconds. December 1941, two moments that changed everything. On December 7th, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, dragging America into the war. Just 4 days later, Hitler declared war on the United States, probably the worst strategic decision in military history. But these weren't coordinated moves. Germany didn't know Japan was hitting Pearl Harbor. Japan had no idea Hitler would declare war on America. The Axis powers were supposed to be allies, but they fought completely separate wars on opposite sides of the planet. This is the story of how the alliance between Germany, Japan, and yes, even the Soviet Union for a brief moment, shaped the bloodiest conflict humanity has ever seen, and how their failure to actually work together determined who won and who lost. The problem was simple but massive. Germany and Japan both wanted to expand their empires, both hated communism, both signed a formal alliance, but they never agreed on one critical thing: what to do about the Soviet Union. And this disagreement, this fundamental strategic disconnect, meant that the largest alliance in history never actually functioned as an alliance. To understand why, we need to go back to where it all started. Let's rewind to 1919. World War I just ended. Germany got absolutely destroyed by the Treaty of Versailles. They lost territory, had to pay insane amounts of money to the winners, their military got reduced to almost nothing, and the entire nation felt humiliated. The German economy collapsed. Inflation got so bad that people needed wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy bread. In 1923, $1 was worth 4.2 trillion German marks. Think about that. Your life savings couldn't buy a sandwich. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Japan had a different problem. They won World War I. They were on the winning side, but they felt disrespected. At the Paris Peace Conference, Japan proposed a racial equality clause. They wanted the treaty to say that all nations should be treated equally regardless of race. Sounds reasonable, right? The Western powers, including the United States, Britain, and Australia, rejected it. Japan never forgot that insult. Both nations felt wronged by the world order. Both wanted respect. Both wanted resources. Both started looking at their neighbors and seeing opportunities for expansion. Germany had Adolf Hitler, who rose to power in 1933 with promises to make Germany great again, to restore national pride, to rip up the Treaty of Versailles and take back what was theirs. His ideology was based on racial superiority, living space for Germans in the East, and the destruction of communism. He blamed Jews for Germany's problems. He blamed communists. He blamed the Western powers who humiliated Germany. And he had a plan to fix it all through military conquest. Japan had its own militarists. After the Great Depression hit in 1929, Japan's economy suffered. They needed resources: oil, rubber, metal, food. Japan is a small island nation with almost no natural resources, so the military leaders looked at China, at Southeast Asia, at the Pacific, and they saw everything they needed just sitting there. The civilian government in Japan got weaker, the military got stronger, and they started taking what they wanted. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, a region in northern China. The League of Nations, which was supposed to prevent wars, condemned Japan. So Japan just left the League of Nations and kept Manchuria anyway. Nobody stopped them. This taught Japan an important lesson: international law doesn't matter if you're strong enough. In 1933, Hitler pulled Germany out of the League of Nations too, same reason. He was already planning to rebuild the German military, which the Treaty of Versailles banned. By 1935, Germany openly announced they were rearming. They introduced military conscription again. They started building tanks, planes, submarines. The Western powers complained, but did nothing. Hitler learned the same lesson Japan did: you can break the rules if nobody stops you. Now here's where it gets interesting. Germany and Japan had a common enemy, the Soviet Union. The USSR was the world's first communist state, and both Hitler and the Japanese military hated communism. Hitler saw it as a Jewish conspiracy to destroy civilization. Japan saw it as a threat to their traditional values and their emperor system. Plus, the Soviet Union sat right between Germany and Japan geographically. It was massive, resource-rich, and vulnerable. In 1936, Germany and Japan signed the Anti-Comintern Pact. Comintern was the Soviet organization trying to spread communism worldwide. This pact was basically an agreement that said Germany and Japan would work together against communist expansion. Italy joined in 1937. This was the beginning of the Axis alliance. But there was a problem nobody talked about openly. Germany and Japan had completely different strategic goals. Hitler wanted to conquer Europe, particularly Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, to create living space for Germans. His entire ideology was built around expanding eastward, destroying the Soviets, and enslaving or killing the Slavic peoples. Japan wanted to conquer Asia and the Pacific. They called it the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which was propaganda for a Japanese colonial empire. They wanted China, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, and the Pacific Islands. The Soviet Union was in their way too, but it wasn't their main target. So even though they were allies against the Soviets, they never actually planned coordinated attacks. They were fighting separate wars for separate goals, and this lack of coordination would haunt them. Let's talk about the Soviet Union for a minute, because this is where things get really weird. The USSR under Stalin was paranoid, brutal, and desperate to avoid a two-front war. Stalin knew that if Germany attacked from the west and Japan attacked from the east at the same time, the Soviet Union would probably lose. The country was huge but vulnerable. The Red Army was strong, but not strong enough to fight two major powers simultaneously. Stalin's solution was brilliant and horrifying. He played both sides. He signed treaties with everyone, bought time, and prepared for the inevitable war. In the 1930s, the Soviet Union actually had border conflicts with Japan. In 1938, there was a battle at Lake Kherson on the Soviet-Korean border. Soviet and Japanese forces fought for control of some hills. The Soviets won, but it was close. Then in 1939, there was a much bigger fight at Khalkhin Gol, also called Nomonhan, on the Mongolian-Manchurian border. This battle is crucial to understanding why Japan never invaded the Soviet Union. A Soviet general named Georgy Zhukov, who would later become one of the most important commanders of World War II, crushed the Japanese forces. He used tanks, aircraft, and artillery in a coordinated assault that destroyed an entire Japanese army. Japan suffered around 18,000 casualties. The Soviets had losses too, but they won decisively. This defeat traumatized the Japanese military. They realized the Soviet Union was way stronger than they thought. Their army was designed for fighting in China, not for massive mechanized warfare against a European-style military. The Japanese generals started having serious doubts about attacking the Soviets. But here's the twist. In August 1939, the world was shocked when Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named after the foreign ministers who negotiated it. Hitler and Stalin, the two leaders who supposedly hated each other, suddenly became friends. The pact included secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe between them. Poland would be split. The Baltic states would go to the Soviets. Finland, too. Germany wanted this pact because Hitler was about to invade Poland, and he didn't want the Soviets to stop him. Stalin wanted it because he needed time to prepare for the war he knew was coming eventually. Both leaders were cynically using each other. Japan was furious. They had the Anti-Comintern Pact with Germany, an anti-Soviet alliance, and Germany just signed a friendship treaty with the Soviets without even telling Japan first. The Japanese government felt betrayed. They were literally in the middle of fighting the Soviets at Khalkhin Gol when they found out their ally had switched sides. This betrayal changed Japanese strategy. They started thinking that maybe attacking the Soviet Union wasn't such a great idea. Maybe they should focus on Southeast Asia instead, where the colonial powers like Britain, France, and the Netherlands had all those resources Japan needed. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. World War II had officially started. The Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east on September 17th, taking their share according to the secret pact with Germany. Poland was crushed in weeks. The German military used a new strategy called Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Fast-moving tanks, supported by aircraft, punched through enemy lines and encircled their armies before they could react. It was devastatingly effective. The old way of fighting, with static trench warfare like World War I, was obsolete. Then came the Winter War. In November 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland. Stalin wanted territory and a buffer zone to protect Leningrad. He thought it would be easy. It wasn't. The Finns fought like crazy, using guerrilla tactics, ski troops, and knowledge of the terrain to inflict massive casualties on the Soviets. The USSR eventually won through sheer numbers, but it was embarrassing. The Red Army looked weak and incompetent. Hitler noticed. In spring 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. Then in May, they launched the big one, the invasion of France. Germany went through Belgium and the Netherlands, bypassing the heavy French fortifications along the German border. The French army was huge, well-equipped, modern. It should have been a tough fight. Instead, Germany won in 6 weeks. The fall of France shocked the world. France was supposed to be a major military power. They had more tanks than Germany, but German tactics, speed, and coordination were superior. The French and British forces got trapped at Dunkirk, and while over 300,000 soldiers escaped across the English Channel, they left behind all their equipment. Britain now stood alone against Germany. Japan watched all of this very carefully. They saw Germany conquering Europe with ease. They saw France fall, the Netherlands fall, Britain on the ropes, and they noticed something important. All those European colonies in Asia were now vulnerable. France controlled Indochina, which is modern-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The Netherlands controlled Indonesia. Britain controlled Burma, Malaya, Singapore, and Hong Kong. If Japan moved fast, they could take all of it. But there was a problem: the United States. America wasn't in the war yet, but they were clearly sympathetic to Britain. President Franklin Roosevelt was sending weapons, ships, and supplies to help Britain survive. And the US was also putting pressure on Japan to stop their war in China. Japan had been fighting in China since 1937, a brutal conflict that was draining resources and going nowhere. The US started imposing economic sanctions on Japan, restricting oil and metal exports. This created a dilemma for Japan. They needed oil desperately. Most of their oil came from the United States. If America cut off oil completely, the Japanese military would run out of fuel in months. They couldn't continue the war in China, couldn't defend their empire, couldn't operate their navy. But the only way to get oil without America was to take the oil fields in Southeast Asia, particularly in the Dutch East Indies, modern Indonesia. If Japan attacked Southeast Asia, America would probably enter the war. But if Japan didn't attack, they'd run out of oil anyway. They felt trapped. In June 1941, everything changed. Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. This was the largest military invasion in human history. Over 3 million German soldiers, supported by Romanian, Hungarian, Italian, and Finnish troops, crossed the border into Soviet territory along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Hitler broke his pact with Stalin. The non-aggression treaty meant nothing. This was always Hitler's plan. He wanted to destroy the Soviet Union, seize its resources, and create living space for Germans. Everything else was just preparation for this moment. The initial German advance was incredibly successful. Soviet forces were caught completely off guard. Stalin had ignored warnings from his own intelligence services and from Britain that Germany was about to attack. He trusted Hitler to keep the pact, at least for a while longer. He was wrong. German armies encircled and destroyed entire Soviet formations. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured in the first weeks. The Germans pushed deep into Soviet territory, heading toward Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center, and Kiev in the south. It looked like the Soviet Union was about to collapse. And this is where the biggest what-if of World War II comes in. If Japan had attacked the Soviet Union from the east, At the same time Germany attacked from the west, Stalin would have been finished. The Red Army couldn't fight a two-front war while also dealing with the catastrophic losses from the German invasion. Soviet forces in the Far East would have had to stay there to defend against Japan, meaning they couldn't be transferred west to defend Moscow. Germany and Japan had a golden opportunity to crush their common enemy. This was the moment. This was what the Anti-Comintern Pact was supposedly all about, but Japan didn't attack. Here's why. First, the Japanese military was divided. The army wanted to attack the Soviet Union. They called it the Northern Strategy. The Navy wanted to attack south into Southeast Asia and the Pacific. They called it the Southern Strategy. These two branches of the Japanese military genuinely hated each other. They barely cooperated, fought over resources, and had completely different visions for Japan's future. Second, Japan had just signed their own neutrality pact with the Soviet Union in April 1941. Yes, you read that right. 2 months before Germany invaded the USSR, Japan signed a treaty promising not to attack them. Stalin and the Japanese Foreign Minister Matsuoka had worked out a deal. The Soviets wanted to secure their eastern border so they could focus on Germany. Japan wanted to secure their northern border so they could focus on Southeast Asia. It was mutually beneficial. Third, Japan remembered Khalkhin Gol. They remembered getting destroyed by Zhukov. The Soviet forces in the Far East were strong, well-equipped, and defending their own territory. An invasion would be risky and might not even succeed. Fourth, the Southern Strategy made more sense for Japan's immediate needs. Southeast Asia had oil, rubber, rice, tin, and other resources Japan desperately needed. The Soviet Far East had forests, cold weather, and not much else. From a purely practical standpoint, going south was smarter. So Japan made their choice. They would not attack the Soviet Union. They would go south instead. And this decision changed everything. In July 1941, Japan occupied southern Indochina. This was the final straw for the United States. President Roosevelt froze all Japanese assets in the US and imposed a complete oil embargo. Britain and the Dutch government in exile did the same. Japan was now cut off from 90% of its oil supply. The Japanese leadership faced a countdown. They had about 18 months of oil reserves. After that, their military would be paralyzed. They had 3 options: back down and withdraw from China, which was politically impossible and would be seen as humiliating; negotiate with the US, which they tried but got nowhere because America demanded complete Japanese withdrawal from China and Indochina; or go to war, seize the oil fields in Southeast Asia, and hope they could win quickly before America's industrial might overwhelmed them. They chose war, but they knew they couldn't just attack the Dutch East Indies. If they did, the US and Britain would declare war anyway. So the plan was to hit everyone at once, cripple the American Pacific Fleet so badly that the US would need years to recover, and establish a defensive perimeter across the Pacific that would be too costly for America to break through. Then maybe, hopefully, America would negotiate peace and let Japan keep their new empire. It was a desperate gamble based on several huge assumptions that turned out to be wrong. But in late 1941, Japanese planners convinced themselves it could work. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched surprise attacks across the Pacific. The most famous was Pearl Harbor, where Japanese carrier aircraft struck the US naval base in Hawaii, sinking or damaging 8 battleships and destroying hundreds of aircraft. Over 2,400 Americans died. But Pearl Harbor wasn't the only attack that day. Japan also hit the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Malaya, Hong Kong, and Thailand. It was a coordinated assault on an unbelievable scale. Within hours, Japan was at war with the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands. Germany was surprised. They had no idea Japan was about to do this. There was no coordination. Hitler found out from the news like everyone else, but he saw an opportunity. On December 11th, just 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Hitler declared war on the United States. This was probably the single dumbest strategic decision Hitler ever made, and he made a lot of dumb decisions. Germany was not required to declare war on the US. The Tripartite Pact, which Germany, Italy, and Japan signed in 1940, only required them to help each other if one of them was attacked. Japan attacked the US, not the other way around. Germany had no obligation to join the war. But Hitler declared war anyway. He thought Japan would tie down American forces in the Pacific. He thought the US wouldn't be able to help Britain as much. He thought German submarines could starve Britain into surrender by sinking supply ships from America. He was wrong on all counts. The United States now entered World War II in both Europe and the Pacific. American industrial production, already the largest in the world, shifted into total war mode. The sleeping giant was awake and angry. Let's get back to the Eastern Front, because that's where World War II was really decided. Everything else, North Africa, Italy, the Pacific, even D-Day, those were all sideshows compared to the epic struggle between Germany and the Soviet Union. By December 1941, German forces were at the gates of Moscow. They could see the Kremlin towers. The Soviet government evacuated to the east. Stalin stayed in Moscow, refusing to leave. It was the closest Germany ever got to winning. Then winter hit. Russian winter is brutal. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees. German soldiers didn't have proper winter clothing. Their vehicles wouldn't start. Oil froze. Weapons jammed. Meanwhile, Soviet forces, equipped for winter warfare, launched a counterattack. Fresh troops from Siberia, the same ones Stalin could now send west because Japan wasn't attacking, pushed the Germans back from Moscow. This was the first time the German army had been stopped. They didn't take Moscow. The Blitzkrieg had failed. The quick victory Hitler expected turned into a grinding war of attrition, which Germany couldn't win. But Germany didn't give up. In 1942, Hitler launched a new offensive, this time aimed at the south. The goal was to capture the oil fields in the Caucasus region and the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. The Battle of Stalingrad became one of the most brutal urban battles in history. For months, German and Soviet forces fought building by building, room by room, in the ruined city. The Soviets refused to give up. Stalin had issued Order 227, not one step back. Soldiers who retreated could be shot by their own side. The city became a meat grinder, consuming hundreds of thousands of lives. In November 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a massive counterattack that encircled the entire German Sixth Army in Stalingrad. Over 250,000 German soldiers were trapped. Hitler refused to let them retreat. They fought until they ran out of ammunition, food, and hope. In February 1943, the survivors surrendered. Only about 90,000 soldiers were taken prisoner, and only a few thousand of them ever made it home after the war. Stalingrad was the turning point. After this, Germany was on the defensive in the east. The Red Army grew stronger while the German army grew weaker. The Soviets had more men, more factories, more resources. They could replace their losses. Germany couldn't. In July 1943, Germany tried one more offensive at Kursk. It was the largest tank battle in history. Thousands of tanks, millions of men, clashing in a relatively small area. The Germans wanted to encircle Soviet forces, cut them off, and restore their momentum. The Soviets knew the attack was coming, prepared massive defenses, and stopped the German advance cold. After Kursk, Germany never launched another strategic offensive in the east. From mid-1943 onward, the Red Army pushed west. They liberated Soviet territory, then moved into Eastern Europe. Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, Hungary, Yugoslavia. The Soviets crushed everything in their path. The German army fought desperately, but they were outnumbered and outproduced. And through all of this, Japan did nothing to help. The Soviet Union was fighting for survival against Germany, and Japan, Germany's supposed ally, just watched. Those Soviet troops from Siberia who stopped the Germans at Moscow, they were only available because Japan wasn't a threat in the east. If Japan had attacked, those troops would have stayed in Siberia, Moscow might have fallen, and the entire war could have gone differently. Let's switch back to the Pacific, because Japan had their own problems. The initial Japanese offensive was incredibly successful. They took the Philippines, forcing American General Douglas MacArthur to flee. They took Singapore, Britain's fortress in Asia, in what Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. They took the Dutch East Indies and got their oil. They took Burma, threatening India. They took islands across the Pacific. In 6 months, Japan conquered an empire spanning millions of square miles. But the American aircraft carriers weren't at Pearl Harbor when Japan attacked. They survived. And in May 1942, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, American and Japanese carrier fleets fought to a draw, stopping Japanese expansion toward Australia. Then in June 1942, at the Battle of Midway, the U.S. Navy destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers in a single day. Japan lost the elite pilots and planes it couldn't replace. Midway was the turning point in the Pacific. After this, Japan was on the defensive. The United States started island hopping, taking one island after another, moving closer to Japan. Each battle was horrific. The Japanese soldiers fought to the death, almost never surrendering. American casualties were heavy, but Japanese casualties were worse. By 1944, American bombers were reaching Japan itself. By 1945, entire Japanese cities were being firebombed, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. The Japanese economy was collapsing. Their navy was destroyed. Their air force was gone. They started using kamikaze suicide attacks because they didn't have enough skilled pilots left. But Japan refused to surrender. The military leadership believed in fighting to the bitter end. They talked about 100 million Japanese dying to defend the homeland. The civilian government wanted to negotiate peace, but couldn't control the military. Japan was trapped in a war they knew they'd lost, but couldn't figure out how to end. Meanwhile, Germany was dying too. By 1945, Soviet forces were in Poland, heading for Berlin. The Western Allies, America and Britain, had landed in Normandy in June 1944, liberated France, and were pushing into Germany from the west. Italy had already surrendered in 1943. Germany was being crushed from all sides. Hitler spent his final days in a bunker under Berlin, giving orders to armies that no longer existed, blaming everyone but himself for Germany's defeat. On April 30, 1945, as Soviet soldiers fought in the streets above him, Hitler committed suicide. A week later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over, but Japan fought on alone. Here's where the Soviet Union comes back into the story in the most unexpected way. Remember, the USSR had a neutrality pact with Japan. They weren't at war. But at the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Stalin promised Roosevelt and Churchill that the Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's defeat. Why would Stalin do this? Several reasons. First, the US and Britain promised him territory. The Soviet Union would get the Kuril Islands and southern Sakhalin from Japan, plus influence in Manchuria and Korea. Second, Stalin wanted a seat at the table when the post-war world was divided up. If the USSR helped defeat Japan, they'd have more say in Asia. Third, and this is important, Stalin wanted to grab as much territory as he could before Japan surrendered. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The city was obliterated. Over 70,000 people died instantly. Japan's leadership was shocked, but still debating whether to surrender. Some wanted to keep fighting. On August 8, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. The next day, they launched a massive invasion of Manchuria. Over 1.5 million Soviet troops, with thousands of tanks and aircraft, smashed through Japanese defenses. The Japanese army in Manchuria, weakened by years of war and stripped of resources, collapsed in days. Also on August 9th, the United States dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. Another 40,000 people died instantly. Japan was now facing atomic weapons and a fresh Soviet invasion. Emperor Hirohito finally intervened and decided Japan had to surrender. On August 15, 1945, he announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast, the first time most Japanese people had ever heard their emperor's voice. World War II was over. The Soviet Union had entered the war against Japan at the last possible moment, fought for less than a week, and claimed victory. They occupied Manchuria, Korea north of the 38th parallel, and the territories Stalin had been promised. The Cold War division of Korea, which led to the Korean War and still exists today, came directly from this Soviet invasion. The irony is incredible. Germany and Japan were allies against the Soviet Union. They signed treaties about it. But when Germany attacked the USSR, Japan stayed neutral. When the USSR finally attacked Japan, Germany was already dead. The Axis alliance never functioned as an actual alliance. Germany and Japan fought separate wars, never coordinated their strategies, and both lost. So what actually happened here? Why did the Axis powers fail so badly at being allies? The fundamental problem was that Germany and Japan had different goals, different enemies, and different strategic situations. Hitler's obsession was destroying the Soviet Union and conquering Eastern Europe. Everything he did was aimed at that. Japan's focus was building an empire in Asia and the Pacific to secure resources. The Soviet Union was an obstacle for Japan, but not the main target. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, that was Japan's moment to strike from the east. If they had coordinated their attack, Stalin would have faced an impossible situation. But Japan chose not to attack. They signed a neutrality pact with the Soviets instead and went south after resources. This decision saved the Soviet Union and doomed both Germany and Japan. The geographical distance between Germany and Japan made coordination nearly impossible anyway. They were separated by the entire Soviet Union. They couldn't easily communicate, couldn't share resources, couldn't support each other militarily. They were allies on paper, but fought completely separate wars in practice. Germany's decision to declare war on the United States after Pearl Harbor was another massive strategic failure. Hitler gained nothing from it and gave America a clear justification to prioritize the war in Europe. If Germany had stayed neutral with the US, America might have focused entirely on Japan first. The Soviet factor was crucial. Stalin played his cards brilliantly, signing pacts with both Germany and Japan at different times, always buying time and playing his enemies against each other. When Germany attacked, Stalin survived partly because Japan didn't attack too. Those Siberian troops that saved Moscow were only available because Japan was busy elsewhere. Japan's leadership made catastrophic miscalculations. They thought they could knock out the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor and then defend their empire until America got tired and negotiated peace. They didn't understand American industrial power or American anger after a surprise attack. They didn't realize that attacking the US was essentially suicide. America's production capacity was so overwhelming that Japan never had a chance in a long war. Germany's leadership, specifically Hitler, made even worse decisions. Invading the Soviet Union while still at war with Britain was questionable. Declaring war on the United States while fighting the Soviets was insane. Hitler's racial ideology, his refusal to listen to his generals, his insistence on holding every inch of ground instead of retreating when necessary, all of these led to disaster. The coordination between Germany and Japan was so poor that they're almost better described as two separate wars that happened to occur at the same time, with some overlapping participants, rather than a coordinated alliance fighting together. Italy was in the Axis too, and they were even less helpful, requiring German forces to bail them out in North Africa and the Balkans instead of contributing meaningfully to the war effort. Meanwhile, the Allies, despite having their own conflicts and disagreements, managed to coordinate much better. The US and Britain worked closely together, agreeing on strategy, sharing intelligence, coordinating operations. The Soviet Union fought separately but still benefited from American and British supplies through Lend-Lease. The Western Allies and Soviets agreed to prioritize defeating Germany first, then deal with Japan. This coordination worked. The numbers tell the story. The Soviet Union suffered the most casualties of anyone in the war, somewhere between 20 and 27 million dead, most of them from the German invasion. Germany lost around 5 to 7 million people. Japan lost around 2 to 3 million. But the Soviet Union survived and won. Germany and Japan didn't. The difference was that the USSR, despite its massive losses, had the resources, manpower, and strategic depth to keep fighting. Germany and Japan exhausted themselves fighting enemies on multiple fronts who had more resources than they did. The atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki get a lot of attention as the reason Japan surrendered, and they were certainly important. But the Soviet invasion of Manchuria was also a critical factor. Japan had been hoping the Soviet Union might mediate peace negotiations with the US. When the Soviets invaded instead, that hope died. Japan was now completely isolated, facing atomic weapons and Soviet armies with no possible way out except surrender. The post-war world was shaped by these final moments of the war. The Soviet Union's quick grab of territory in Asia set up the Cold War confrontation in Korea and created tensions that still exist today. The complete defeat of Germany and Japan allowed the Allies to rebuild these countries from scratch, leading to the prosperous, democratic nations they became. The United States emerged from the war as a global superpower, the only major nation whose homeland was untouched by the fighting. World War II killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million people. It was the deadliest conflict in human history. The failure of Germany and Japan to coordinate as allies didn't cause all those deaths, but it certainly determined who won and who lost. If Japan had attacked the Soviet Union when Germany did, if they had actually fought as true allies instead of separate nations with separate wars, the outcome might have been very different. We might be living in a very different world. But they didn't. The Axis alliance was a failure, and that failure, combined with the determination of the Allied powers and the resilience of the Soviet people, decided the war. Germany and Japan both gambled everything on military conquest. They both lost. The Soviet Union, against all odds, survived the largest invasion in history and came back to win. The United States, pulled into the war by surprise attacks, mobilized its enormous industrial power and helped defeat both Axis powers. The lesson, if there is one, is that wars aren't won by fancy alliances on paper. They're won by coordination, resources, industrial capacity, and the will to keep fighting when everything seems lost. The Axis powers had the fancy alliance. The Allied powers had everything else, and that made all the difference. If this story got you thinking about how history could have gone differently, check out the next video.